the forgotten medieval habit of sleeping twice. It seems embarrassingly pointless to ask how people slept in the Middle Ages. The answer, of course, is that we slept the way we do. No, they didn't. That would make this post too short, and I want to make sure you get your money's worth here. They divided the night into two separate sleeps, which seems to be how everyone in the pre-industrial world slept. The sources I found are heavily skewed toward Europe, but some say the practice continues today in non-industrialized pockets of the world. Sleeping twice. Recall that this was a time when artificial lighting was not very common, meaning no electricity, no gas lights. Sure, they had candles, but they were expensive and not very bright. And when people went to bed, they either blew them out or risked burning the house down. So when it got dark, they, or most of them, would walk to bed. We'll get to the bed definition in a moment. They woke up a few hours later, not because that was the plan, but simply because they woke up. And they spent a few more hours, say, from 11 to 1, no one looking at the clock, either awake or up, in either case without thinking about what was wrong or how they were going to get back to sleep, because waking up in the middle of the night was exactly what happened. This continued into the early 19th century, and several studies documented this type of sleeping among people who were not in the industrial age and among people who were meant to live without the lighting and entertainment of the industrial age. What did they do in between sleeps? Some people lay in bed and chatted, because at least in the Middle Ages, people who slept alone were rare. Some got up and worked, by moonlight, by starlight, by reed light. These were waxed reed stalks, the candle substitutes for ordinary household candles, by candlelight if they could afford to buy candles. But those who could afford to buy them probably didn't need to work in the middle of the night. All the people you'd expect to recommend prayer and meditation recommended the time between sleep as a time for prayer and meditation, and no doubt some people did both. People drank their religion straight back then. No ice, no mixers. I've read about monks and nuns getting up in the middle of the night and going to the chapel to pray, and it felt completely punishing. I imagined someone having to pull them out of their sleepy little beds. That puts it in a different light. They were already awake. If prayer was the purpose of their lives, this was the time to go to prayer. The time between sleeps was also the time for intercourse, and was considered a particularly good time for having children. Sex, when people weren't sleeping alone. First, sharing a bed didn't mean that all the occupants had to get up or stay in bed at the same time. For another, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I read this somewhere, but I haven't looked for a source to confirm what my memory insists, and say that sex wasn't considered something people should do in private. Privacy wasn't a thing yet. Sex was always a thing. In the early Middle Ages, even your local lord and lady would sleep in the parlor with their children, lackeys, guests, servants, maids, and anyone else I forgot to list. Solar energy, a room for the aristocracy only, plus maybe a servant or three on hand if needed, didn't come along until the mid-Middle Ages. Eventually, people went back to bed for what was called the morning nap. Beds. If you were wealthy enough in the Middle Ages, your bed would be grand and impressive, with several mattresses, straw, then wool, then feathers and sheets, blankets, covers, pillows, cushions, all that good stuff. The bed was your most important piece of furniture. A duvet. It was a bedspread, but it seems to have disappeared into something smaller in recent times. The curtains and valances that we think of as symbols of noble beds came into use in the mid-Middle Ages. The beds of middle-class people were simple wooden bedsteads with simple headboards and as much furniture as they could afford. The important thing was that they were off the ground. Everyone else. It depends on what time period we're talking about, but at least in the early Middle Ages, they slept on the floor. They might have had a mattress stuffed with straw, wool, hair, rags, or feathers, or a combination of these. Whatever it was made of, it could be moved out of the way during the day. As I write this, a few wildflowers called bedstraw, and ladies' bed straw are just blooming on the bushes. I couldn't find much about bed straw, but ladies' bed straw, the Lady of the Virgin Mary, not the local Lady Muck, was added to straw mattresses for both its scent and to keep fleas away. It was also believed to aid childbirth. If you were at the bottom of the economic and social pile, you would sleep on straw or grass, or, according to one website, on a dirt floor. An article in the BBC. There's an article in the BBC that says the poor can sleep on a handful of heather, and I hate to argue with the BBC, but there's a bit of it growing behind us, and it's quite woody. I haven't tried sleeping on it, but I think I'd be better off on bare ground. So how do we know all this? In the 1990s, historian Roger Ekirch was researching a book on the history of the night. He didn't expect to find anything new for a chapter on sleep, but how could he write about the night and ignore sleep? He was such a good historian that he started looking into court testimony, where all sorts of weird and wonderful facts about everyday life could be found. What he found was a 17th century case that casually mentioned a first sleep or a second sleep. The case concerned an incident that happened in the interval between the two. He kept digging and found many references to what he now called biphasic sleep. It appeared in letters, diaries, medical textbooks, philosophical writings, newspaper articles, ballads, and plays. He found records or hints of it in Europe, Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Australia, South America, and the Middle East, the earliest dating back to the 8th century BCE. And somehow, all of this has escaped our awareness. The forgotten medieval habit of two sleeps. For thousands of years, people had slept in two shifts, one in the evening and one in the morning. So why? And how did the habit disappear? It was around 11 p.m. on April the 13th, 1699, in a small village in the north of England. 9-year-old Jane Roth blinked her eyes open and looked out into the gloomy evening shadows. She and her mother had just woken from a short nap. Mrs. Roth got up and went to the fireplace of their modest home, where she began to smoke a pipe. Just then, two men appeared at the window. They called to her and told her to get ready to go with them. As Jane later explained in a courtroom, her mother was clearly expecting visitors. She went with them freely, but first she whispered to her daughter, "Lie still, the morning will come again." Perhaps Mrs. Roth had a nightly task to complete, or maybe she was in trouble and knew that leaving the house was risky. Either way, Jane's mother broke her promise. She never returned home. That night, Mrs. Roth was brutally murdered, and her body was found the next day. The crime was never solved. Nearly 300 years later, in the early 1990s, historian Roger Ekirch walked through the arched entrance to the Public Record Office in London, an impressive Gothic building that housed the National Archives of the United Kingdom from 1838 to 2003. There, among endless old vellum paper and manuscripts, he found Jane's testimony. And there was something strange about it. Ekirch was initially researching a book on the history of the night, and at the time he was examining records covering the period between the early Middle Ages and the Industrial Revolution. He was afraid to write the chapter on sleep because he thought it was not only a universal necessity, but also a biological constant. He doubted he would find anything new. So far, he has found the court testimonies particularly illuminating. They are a wonderful resource for social historians, says Ekirch, a professor at Virginia Tech in the US. They comment on activities that are often unrelated to the crime itself. But as she read Jane's confession, she heard two words that captured a particularly tantalizing detail of 17th century life she had never encountered before: the first sleep. I can quote the original document almost word for word. Ekirch says, "And the thrill of the discovery is palpable even decades later." In the Middle Ages, shared sleeping was perfectly normal. Newly acquainted travelers would share a bed with their masters and servants. Source: British Library. Jane testifies that she and her mother had woken from their first sleep of the evening just before the men arrived at their home. There was no other explanation. The interrupted sleep was simply stated in a casual way, as if it was something completely out of the ordinary. He spoke of it as if it were perfectly normal, says E. Kirsch. The first sleep implies the second sleep, a night divided into two halves. Was this just a family quirk? Or was it something more? Omnipresence. Over the following months, Ekirch combed through the archives, finding many more references to this mysterious phenomenon of double sleep, or biphasic sleep, as he later called it. Some were fairly mundane, such as the weaver John Cockburn's accidental inclusion in his account. But others were darker, such as Luke Atkinson from the east of Yorkshire. He managed to squeeze an early morning murder into his sleep one night. And according to his wife, he often used the time to visit other people's homes on sinister business. When Ekirch expanded his research to include other written records online, it quickly became clear that the phenomenon was more widespread and normalized than he had imagined. For starters, the first mention of sleep is in one of the most famous works of medieval literature, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written between 1387 and 1400, which is presented as a storytelling contest among a group of pilgrims. It also appears in poet William Baldwin's Beware the Cat, 1561, a satirical book considered by some to be the first novel, and centers on a man who learns to understand the language of a group of terrifying supernatural cats, one of whom, the mouse catcher, is on trial for prostitution. But that's just the beginning. Ekirch found random references to the system of sleeping, twice in every conceivable form. There were hundreds of them in letters, diaries, medical textbooks, philosophical writings, newspaper articles, and plays. The practice was even reflected in ballads like Old Robin of Portingale. And when the first sleeper wakes, you will have a warm drink prepared, and when the next sleeper wakes, your sorrows will be calmed. Biphasic sleep was not unique to England. It was widely practiced throughout the pre-industrial world. In France, the first sleep was called the premier somme. In Italy, it was the primo sonno. In fact, Ekirch found evidence of the practice in places as far afield as Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Australia, South America, and the Middle East. Like many Romans, the historian Livy may have been a practitioner of biphasic sleep. He mentions the method in his masterpiece, The History of Rome, source Alamy. A colonial record from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, from 1555 describes the Tupinamba people taking their first nap before dinner, while a 19th century record from Muscat, Oman, describes locals taking their first nap before 10 p.m. And far from being a medieval feature, Ekirch began to suspect that this method had been the dominant sleeping pattern for thousands of years, an ancient assumption we inherited from our prehistoric ancestors. The first record Ekirch found was in the 12,109-line Greek epic poem The Odyssey from the 8th century BC. The last hints of its existence date back to the early 20th century, before it somehow faded into obscurity. How did it work? Why did people do it? And how did something that was once completely normal become so completely forgotten? A moment of emptiness. A night's sleep in the 17th century went something like this. From 9 p.m. to 11 p.m., those lucky enough to afford them would lie down on mattresses stuffed with straw or rags, feathers if they were rich, and prepare to sleep for a few hours. At the bottom of the social ladder, people had to settle into scattered scrub, or worse, bare dirt floors, perhaps without blankets. At that time, most people slept in groups, and they often found themselves in the company of bedbugs, fleas, lice, family members, friends, servants, and, if they were traveling, complete strangers. To minimize any awkwardness, sleep included a series of strict social rules, such as avoiding physical contact or moving around too much, and there were set sleeping positions. For example, girls usually slept on one side of the bed, the oldest closest to the wall, followed by mom and dad. Then boys, again, in order of age, then anyone outside the family. After a few hours, people would start to wake up from this initial sleep. Nighttime wakefulness would usually last from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., depending on when they went to bed. It was usually not caused by noise or other disturbances during the night, and it was not triggered by any alarms. They were only invented in 1787, somewhat ironically by an American man who had to wake up in time to sell watches. Instead, waking up happened completely naturally, just like in the morning. The period of wakefulness that followed was known as a watch, and it was a surprisingly useful window for getting things done. The records tell us how people did almost everything after they woke up from their first sleep, Ekirch says. Sleeping in groups meant that people often had someone to talk to when they woke up for a watch. Source: Getty Images. Under the dim light of the moon, stars and oil lamps or reeds, a type of candle made from waxed reed stalks used in ordinary homes, people would go about their business of putting wood on the fire, taking medicine or urinating, usually into the fire. For the villagers, waking up meant getting back to more serious work. This could mean checking on the livestock or doing household chores such as patching cloth, carding wool, or stripping reeds for burning. One servant Ekirch encountered even brewed a batch of beer for her employer in Westmoreland between midnight and 2 a.m. Naturally, criminals would take the opportunity to sneak around and cause trouble, like the murderer in Yorkshire. But the hour was also the time of religion. For Christians, there were elaborate prayers to be completed, and special prayers were prescribed for this time period. One father said that the most profitable hour was when, after digesting your supper and leaving the labors of the world, no one will seek you except God. Meanwhile, those of a more philosophical disposition could use the hour as a peaceful moment to reflect on life and mull over new ideas. In the late 18th century, a London merchant even invented a special device for remembering your most burning nighttime insights, a night memory, a closed block of parchment with a horizontal opening that could be used as a writing guide. But it was also used most often for socializing and sex. As Ekirch explains in his book, At Day's Close, A History of Nighttime, people would often stay in bed and chat. And during those strange twilight hours, bedmates could share a level of informality and relaxed conversation that was hard to achieve during the day. For couples who managed the logistics of sharing a bed with others, it was also a convenient break for physical intimacy. If they had had a long day at work, the first nap would ease their fatigue, and the period after was thought to be the perfect time to have multiple children. People would usually go back to bed after staying awake for a few hours. This next step was considered a morning sleep and could last until dawn or later. Just like today, when people finally woke up completely depended on when they went to bed. The Public Record Office was home to thousands of criminal records from the Middle Ages, now stored at the National Archives at Kew. Credit: Getty Images. An old adaptation. According to Ekirch, there are references to the system of sleeping twice throughout the classical period, suggesting it was already widespread at the time. It was casually included in the works of such notable figures as the Greek biographer Plutarch, 1st century AD, the Greek traveler Pausanias, 2nd century AD, the Roman historian Livius, and the Roman poet Virgil. The practice was later adopted by Christians, who immediately saw the potential of the hour as an opportunity for psalms and confessions. In the 6th century AD, Saint Benedict required monks to rise at midnight for these activities, and the idea eventually spread across Europe, gradually spreading to the masses. But humans aren't the only animals to have discovered the benefits of sleep fragmentation. It's common in the natural world, with many species resting in 2 or even several separate episodes. This helps them stay active during the most beneficial times of day, when they're most likely to find food and avoid snacking themselves. One example is the ring-tailed lemur. With their startling red eyes and erect black and white tails, these iconic primates from Madagascar have sleep patterns remarkably similar to pre-industrial humans. They're cathemeral, meaning they're awake day and night. There's a lot of variation among primates in how they distribute their activities over a 24-hour period, says David Sampson, director of the Sleep and Human Evolution Laboratory at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, Canada. And if paired sleeping is natural for some lemurs, he wondered, could it be the way we evolved to sleep? E. Kirch had long had the same feeling, but for decades there was nothing concrete to prove it, or to shed light on why it might have disappeared. In 1995, while searching the internet late one night, E. Kirch came across an article in the New York Times about a sleep experiment that had been done a few years earlier. The study was conducted by Thomas Ware, a sleep scientist at the National Institute of Mental Health, and involved 15 men. After the first week of observing normal sleep patterns, they were deprived of artificial lighting at night to reduce their hours of natural or electrically generated daylight from the normal 16 hours to just 10. The rest of the time, they were confined to a bedroom with no lights or windows and completely enveloped in velvety darkness. They were not allowed to play music or exercise. Instead, they were directed to rest and sleep. Eckhart thinks that people today remember fewer dreams than our ancestors did, perhaps because waking up in the middle of the night is less common. At the start of the experiment, all the men had normal nighttime habits. They slept in one continuous shift from late evening until dawn. Then something incredible happened. After 4 weeks of 10-hour days, their sleep patterns had changed. They were no longer sleeping in one go, but in 2 halves of roughly the same length. These were punctuated by a 1 to 3 hour period when they were awake. Ware had reinvented biphasic sleep. This reading about the experiment was probably the most exciting moment of my life, apart from my wedding and the birth of my children, Eckhart says. I think I can tell you that he was as excited as I was, he says, when he emailed Ware to explain the remarkable fit between his historical research and the scientific work. For most of human history, those who couldn't afford bedding had to sleep on straw or other dry vegetation. Source: Getty Images. More recently, Sampson's own research has backed up these findings with an exciting development. In 2015, Sampson, along with collaborators from other universities, recruited local volunteers from the remote community of Manadena in northeastern Madagascar for a study. The location is a large village behind a national park, and there is no infrastructure for electricity, so nights are as dark as they have been for nearly 1,000 years. The participants, mostly farmers, were asked to wear an actimeter, an advanced activity sensing device that can be used to track sleep patterns for 10 days. We found that in those without artificial light, there was a period of activity from just after midnight until 1 a.m., Sampson says, and then they would go back to sleep and inactivity, and that would usually coincide with sunrise until they woke up at 6 a.m. It turns out that biphasic sleep never completely disappeared. It continues to exist in many parts of the world today. A new social pressure. Collectively, this research gave Eckhart the explanation he longed for as to why most of humanity abandoned 2 sleep systems in the early 19th century. As with other recent changes in our behavior, such as a move toward clock time dependence, the answer was the Industrial Revolution. In the 17th century, wealthy elites often slept in four-poster wooden beds with curtains to keep residents warmer and out of sight of prying visitors. Source: Alamy. Artificial lighting became more common and more powerful. First there was gas lighting, which was first introduced in London, Eckert says, and then of course electric lighting towards the end of the century. And as well as changing people's circadian rhythms, artificial lighting naturally kept people awake later. But even though people no longer went to bed at 9 p.m., they still had to wake up at the same time in the morning, so their rest was disrupted. Eckert believes this made their sleep deeper because it was compressed. In addition to changing the population's circadian rhythms, artificial lighting lengthened the first sleep and shortened the second. And I was able to track this for almost a decade, throughout the 19th century, Eckert says. Interestingly, Samson's study in Madagascar included a second part. Half of the participants were given artificial lights for a week and seen if it made any difference. And in this case, the researchers found that it had no effect on the interrupted sleep patterns. But the researchers note that 1 week may not be enough time for the artificial lights to cause major changes. So, the mystery continues. Although artificial lighting was not the sole culprit, by the end of the 20th century, the distinction between the two sleeps had completely disappeared. The Industrial Revolution had changed not only our technology, but also our biology. A new concern, a major side effect of the change in human sleep habits, was a change in attitudes. For one thing, we quickly began to shame those who slept too much and developed a preoccupation with the connection between waking up early and being productive. But the most satisfying part of all of this, Eckert says, is for those who suffer from midnight insomnia. Our sleep patterns have changed so much that any waking in the middle of the night can send us into a panic, he explains. I don't want to make light of it. I actually suffer from sleep disorders myself, and I take medication for it. But when people learn that this may have been perfectly normal for thousands of years, they find it eases their anxiety a little. But before Eckert's research reveals a byproduct of the paleo diet, and people start throwing away their lights, or worse, artificially splitting their sleep in half with alarm clocks, he wants to emphasize that abandoning the two sleep systems doesn't mean that our sleep quality is worse today. Despite the near-constant headline-grabbing prevalence of sleep problems, Eckert has previously argued that the 21st century is in some ways a golden age for sleep. A time when most of us will no longer have to worry about being killed, frozen to death, or infested with lice in our beds, when we can sleep without pain, without the danger of fire, or without the fear of strangers sleeping next to us. In short, single sleep periods may not be natural. And yet, neither are fancy ergonomic beds or modern hygiene. More seriously, there's no going back because conditions have changed, says Eckert. So we may be missing out on our secret late-night chats in bed, our psychedelic dreams, and our nighttime philosophical explorations, but at least we won't be waking up covered in angry red bites. Thank you very much. Don't forget to subscribe.